Who said, to be or not to be? Was that Willie Shakespeare? I thought of that saying this week, although I recast it. To shovel or not to shovel? When you get 6 inches of snow in April, do you have to shovel it? My neighbor said no. Out of sheer habit, I went out there and I shoveled. Oh, it was heavy snow. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, both my neighbor's driveway and my driveway looked about the same. Go figure. Well, we're continuing through our series, Road to Redemption, from the book of Exodus. And today we're in Exodus chapter 18. I hope you have a Bible. If you forgot a Bible, there are Bibles in the foyer. You can grab one. And they're always there. And if you return it afterwards, then somebody else can use it the next Sunday. So let's begin. When people get married, the focus is usually on the man or woman they're marrying, right? But before long, they realize marriage involves more than just a partner. There are others. And one of those others are in-laws. The in-law relationship, as one learns, has to be managed. If managed well, in-laws can be friends. If not managed well, they become foes. Sadly, much of what we know about in-laws comes from TV sitcoms. Think of shows like Everybody Loves Raymond. While fun to watch and laugh at, can you imagine actually having to live it? Perhaps you can. Exodus 18 is a portrait of an in-law, a father-in-law, Moses' father-in-law, and interestingly, the portrait will be gradually revealed bit by bit until it climaxes in a spiritual insight. Apparently, God's redemptive activity wasn't limited to what was playing out in Egypt. When you read through the book of the Exodus, your mind wanders about how amazing it must have been seeing the unfolding of the 10 plagues, etc. But then you get to chapter 18 and the camera turns in a different direction and it focuses on another person, just a small guy. You can't forget his name because it's so weird. We'll talk about that in a moment. But elsewhere in the region, God was working his way into the lives of individuals, including in-laws. Imagine that. Now, if you think I'm overreading the passage by building this message around a father-in-law theme, I should point out that the term father-in-law is repeated 8 times in a span of 12 verses. 8 times, the author affirms something about Moses' father-in-law. You could say that embedded in these verses is a portrait of a Middle Eastern father-in-law. Do you remember where we are in the Exodus story? Well, let me remind you, the Exodus was history. Israel had escaped from Egypt. They'd crossed the Red Sea, been sustained in the wilderness, had defeated some Bedouin bandits. Next up, Mount Sinai and the 10 Commandments. But before they arrive at Mount Sinai, we have this episode involving in-laws. The title of our message today is A Father-in-Law's Conversion, and it's based on Exodus 18, 1-12. Let's read that. Now Jethro, the priest of Midian and father-in-law of Moses, heard of everything God had done for Moses and for the people Israel, and how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. After Moses had sent away his wife Zipporah, his father-in-law Jethro received her and her 2 sons. One son was named Gershom, for Moses said, I have become a foreigner in a foreign land. And the other was named Eleazar, for he said, my father's God was my helper. He saved me from the sword of Pharaoh. Verse 5. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, together with Moses' sons and wife, came to him in the wilderness, where he was camped near the mountain of God. Jethro had sent word to him, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him. They greeted each other and then went into the tent. Moses told his father-in-law about everything the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and about all the hardships they had met along the way, and how the Lord had saved them. Verse 9. Jethro was delighted to hear about all the good things the Lord had done for Israel in rescuing them from the hand of the Egyptian. He said, Praise be to the Lord, who rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians and of Pharaoh, and who rescued the people from the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods, for he did this to those who had treated Israel arrogantly. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God. This is kind of broke. It's like a broken record, isn't it? Father-in-law, father-in-law, father-in-law this, father-in-law that. It's like the author wants to take the eyes of his readers and say, don't miss the father-in-law and what God is doing in the father-in-law's life. You may have a father-in-law and you think, well, what could God do to my father-in-law? I think he's impenetrable. And here's a story that shows us that far from that being the case. Prior to the incident at Mount Sinai, Moses spent some time with his father-in-law. Do you have memories of time spent with your father-in-law? Once while visiting Diane's parents in Saskatoon, my father-in-law and I were sitting around, basically getting bored. He wasn't coming up with any suggestions, so I thought I'd come up with one. I said, could you show me the different homes you've lived in Saskatoon over the years? So we went for a drive. I was the chauffeur, he was the tour guide. I supplied the gas, he supplied the stories. We made a memory. We spent time together. Well, that wasn't too hard. I still remember it. I'm still talking about it years later. Well, in this portrait of Moses' father-in-law, we learn a number of things about him. One, I'm always curious about a person's background. We learn some things about his background. First, he had an uncommon name, at least for us. I have to tell you, for me, Jethro is not a winsome name. I have never met a person in the flesh who was named Jethro. I would name my dog Jethro. I'd name my cat Jethro, but I would never name a child Jethro. The only Jethro I know of is probably the same one you're thinking of right now. I tested this on Jim Lozelle this week. I told him what I was going to be talking about. And he couldn't get away. He's in a wheelchair, right? So he has to listen to me. And I said, now, do you know anybody by the name of Jethro? And he thought for the longest time, and he said, just one. I said, where did you come across a Jethro? He said, on TV. What show? The Beverly Hillbillies. It's the only person I ever know who has been named that. My strong impression, though, is that the biblical Jethro wasn't at all like the TV version. So let's let the text shape our impression of this man. Let's not prejudge him. So he had an unusual name. He also had a religious vocation. We are told that he was the priest of Midian. Or more to the point, he was a pagan priest. This is really unusual. I mean, does anybody get more spiritual than Moses? We would have thought he came from a long line of believing people. He's got the same issues in his extended family that you and I do. Father-in-law was a pagan. He was a pagan priest. This may come as a surprise, given his son's vocation as Israel's leader and lawgiver. During the Exodus period of Moses' life, he and his father-in-law did not live close geographically. Midian was roughly 500 kilometers from Egypt. 500 kilometers. That's about the same distance from Edmonton to Lethbridge. That's a long ways away. And in those days, you couldn't just, jump into your Honda Accord and lickety-split, get down for a short visit. It wasn't quite so simple. That's a good hike, so they didn't spend weekends together for sure. One wonders if perhaps Moses and his wife had a mixed marriage. Doesn't really say, but it's not that much of a stretch that, he may initially have married someone who was not a believer in Israel's God. For sure, he married into another faith community. Now, if you married a girl whose family was outside your faith community, I imagine there would be some challenges, right? A lot of challenges. Every time there's a wedding, are we going? Are we going to be doing everything at the wedding that everybody else is doing at the wedding? What about Christmas? What about Easter? It's challenging. I wonder how they handled them. My impression from our passage is that they got along well, that they showed respect for one another, that there was affection between them, and those things go a long way. Another thing we learn about Jethro is that he had an ear for what was going on in the world. I hate to tell you this, but I meet a lot of pastors who don't know what's going on in their world. Their world is too small. I had a prof in seminary who said that readers are leaders and leaders are readers. Some pastors don't read spiritual information enough, like the Red Deer Advocate. That should have been part of my job description. Thou shalt get a subscription to the Red Deer Advocate. You need to know the community. I meet pastors who don't have a subscription to the Red Deer Advocate. It blows my mind. But Jethro, he had an ear for what was going on in the world. Although his son-in-law lived some distance away, Jethro had heard rumors of what was going on in Egypt. Caravan traders likely brought word of how the God of Israel had rescued his people by giving Pharaoh a severe thrashing. I try to keep my ear to the ground. I read various publications. They put me in touch with what's happening in North America as well as around the world. Sometimes it's bad news. Sometimes we read about the latest scandal in the evangelical world. Sometimes it's good news. Jethro was like that. He had an ear for what was going on in the world. So that's a bit about Jethro's background. As I think about Jethro's background, it got me musing about the difficulties that families face, our families. Family unity is fragile. It has to be nurtured and maintained. In most families, there's this ebb and flow. There are periods of strain and periods of strong unity. In my family of origin, that's the one I know the best, there have been many highs and lows. During our growing up years, there were seasons of acting out, being disciplined, testing boundaries, maturing, taking on greater responsibilities, learning how to stand on one's own 2 feet, becoming independent. Independent. Oh, I like the sound of that when I was younger. I left home after grade 11, and I never permanently lived with my parents after. Turned out to be a good thing. I was ready to go, and I thrived on independence. But then I had to learn that there was this other complementary quality to independence. You have interdependence. It's one thing to learn to stand on your own 2 feet. It's another thing to learn to stand together. And that's not always easy, because there can be friction and disagreements and broken relationships. And so families have to practice forgiveness and acceptance even when they don't always agree. Families need to acquire the grace of reconciliation, which takes time. How much time? In my experience, years. can take a lot of time to work through some of the bump and grind that we've experienced over the years. Although my family was never particularly close, we did work on it. For over 30 years, my extended family has met every 3 years for a family reunion. And we move it around just to keep it exciting. Sometimes it's in Manitoba, sometimes BC, Ontario. This year it'll be in BC to mark my mom's passing. We're planning a memorial service. It'll be tearful and playful and valuable. And I'm looking forward to it. So don't get me wrong. My family is not a poster family. We have enough dysfunction to fuel a good sitcom. But the practice of getting together every 3 years has kept us from growing apart. During the pandemic, and I chuckle to myself, my shy sister single-handedly instigated a Zoom gathering. Well, didn't anybody tell my sister we don't do that? Our family doesn't do this, and yet every month for the last 2 years or so, she has corralled us together at 10:30 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. It's brought us closer, especially during the closing months of my mom's life. So families need to be together some of the time. It was true of Moses' family, and I suspect that it's true of yours as well. I should also mention that Jethro's faith seemed to be evolving. That is pretty cool. Like sometimes you meet a person and you think, what you see is what you get. That's how they are, and that's how they're always going to be. And as you sift through this Jethro story, there is movement. People's lives are fluid. And there's change that's happening. There's good stuff percolating. Although he's referred to as a priest of Midian by reputation, he'll soon start acting out of character for a priest of Midian. Why is that? Well, maybe when your son-in-law leads a nation of 1 million or more people out of bondage with supernatural authority, it has a way of making a father-in-law sit up and take notice. Maybe there's something to this guy after all. I describe Israel's liberation as with supernatural authority because I don't know what else to call it, 10 plagues, Red Sea crossing, the provision of food and water in the wilderness, and against all odds victory over marauders. It must have made Jethro think and rethink his own beliefs. So, a little bit about the background of Jethro. 2, his generosity. Verses 2-4. Like so many father-in-laws, Jethro offered his adult children a helping hand when they were in a pinch. That's the thing about children. They're always in a pinch. We have 3 kids, so one of our 3 kids at least one of our 3 kids is always in a pinch. So while Moses was off on his mission, Jethro invited their daughter and her kids to stay with him. Makes sense. You probably would have done the same thing. Maybe you have. When families are in trouble or need a helping hand, it's often their families that step up to help. And that's as it should be. When my 3 children were born, they were all cesarean. Those were the days when once a cesarean, always a cesarean, which meant that their mother had some additional healing to do. And each time, who do you suppose stepped up to help? My mom. Grandma. My mom didn't work outside the home, so she gladly had space in her life to come and help out. It was great. My other in-laws did something similar when I was in seminary. We'd come back to Canada each summer, and while we were lining up our accommodations for the next couple of months, we'd stay with them. They were a big help. It was great. That's what Jethro and his family were like. By the way, we should note the names of Moses' sons because they're suggestive of Moses' own journey. Now, I know names are not always like that. We don't do the naming thing today the same way that the ancients did. We often are captivated by sound. We just like the sound, like, Terry, Brian, we. It just kind of has a cadence to it, doesn't it? Well, maybe that's what my parents thought, and so they selected it. His eldest was named Gershom. Sounds strange to us, but it's the Hebrew word for foreigner. And lo and behold, for most of his adult life, Moses has been displaced. He was a Gershom. He was a foreigner. His other son was named Eliezer, which means God is my helper. That was also true of Moses' life. God was always intervening on behalf of Moses. Many of us feel like that. Our life is a real God to the rescue story. So Jethro's background, Jethro's generosity. 3. Jethro convened a family reunion. Did you notice that? Verses 5 to 12. Before Moses led Israel to Mount Sinai for a covenant ceremony, Jethro gathered the family together for a couple of reasons. Partly it was just for fellowship. Pretty soon we're going to be reviving our fellowship moment after the service, and I think some coffee and tea will eventually be getting served, and a lot of people like to hang out and just talk. Might talk about the sermon, what was in the sermon, what wasn't in the sermon. They might talk about their lives, and they just people like to connect and hook up. So they came together partly for fellowship. There are times when family need to withdraw so that they can be together. Like any Middle Eastern family, Jethro's clan showed hospitality and affection. Now, families are all different. The family I grew up in was not really affectionate, but the in-laws, wow, that was just a total different, that was a different kettle of fish. And I felt pretty awkward sometimes, but they're huggers and they were kissers, and it was really something once they got going. And there was sharing, just like with Jethro. And Moses, they brought each other up to speed on recent developments. Moses gave his father-in-law a blow-by-blow description of how the Lord had fought for Israel against the Egyptians and how he had sustained them in the wilderness. Must have had some great stories. The first time these stories got told, it must have been something. Let's get Uncle Moses back here. He has the best story. And sharing, they shared. And then not only were there get-togethers for fellowship, they were also for worship. Wow. Here's a guy who by reputation is the pagan priest, and there's something going on in his life, and now every once in a while things slip into worship mode, like, wow, what's going on here? What's worship? Worship is making much of God, applauding God, bragging about God. Let me tell you what God did. And he started to get pretty excited about some of these stories in verses 9 to 12. The author portrayed Jethro as someone who really warmed up to the faith of his son-in-law. He doesn't sound like the priest of Midian anymore. Verse 9, he took joy in the news of what God had done. Verse 10, he praised the Lord for his redemptive actions. Verse 11, he acknowledged the supremacy of Israel's God. And it says right in verse 11, you can see this for yourself, he acknowledged the supremacy of Israel's God over all other gods. I don't think Midianite priests are supposed to say that, but he started saying that. And that was a clue that something going on in Jethro's life. Verse 12, he hosted a religious meal, a banquet, to celebrate God's accomplishment. So something was happening in Jethro's life. He was embracing the narrative of Moses' faith. Jethro was coming over to Israel's God. Isn't that great? You can just see this guy. And he's making the move, slowly and gradually, but he's coming over to God's side. Was he converting? Let's see, is the word converting in the text? I don't think it's actually there. But it kind of sounds like it. You know the saying, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, sounds like a duck. What do you think? Writers of Scripture knew the readers were smart. They could connect the dots. This is a moment of conversion. And whatever else conversion is holy stuff. This is God's stuff. Now we have just stepped into the room where God is working. Personally, I don't think conversion is ours to independently ring up. I think conversion happens due to divine initiative. God summons and enables, and we respond. There's an element of mystery to it. There's a miracle going on. The hymn writer said it well. And I think we've even sung this here at the chapel from time to time. And I love the humility of the hymn writer. Oh, that we would share in his humility. I know not how this saving faith to me he did impart, nor how believing in his word wrought peace within my heart. That's above my pay grade. I know not how the Spirit moves, convincing men of sin, revealing Jesus through the word, creating faith in him. We talked last week about faith awakening. Conversion is a work of God. It's God's stuff. What can we learn about conversion in our passage? Just a few things as we close. Conversion is about changing sides. We sometimes use the expression regime change. That's what conversion is. There's regime change going on in a person's life. They're coming under new management, God's. In conversion, a person runs up a flag. What color is the cloth of the flag? That would be white. This is an act of surrender. When did you last run up the white flag of surrender? That's conversion stuff. You do it at the beginning of the Christian life, and you keep doing it throughout your Christian life. Secondly, conversion is often unexpected. I hadn't expected to become a Christian in the summer of 70. I wasn't planning on it, but then it happened. My best shot at this is God came